Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video's on changing the wheel bearings on a boat trailer, and of course is for entertainment purposes only. Now, the reason I say that is because jobs like this, if they go wrong, they do have reasonably serious repercussions potentially. You could be travelling down a freeway doing 100 kilometres an hour towing a boat, so this needs to be right in order to sort of make sure no one gets hurt. Ideally, after watching a video like this, if you've never done this job before, try and find someone who has to sort of sit down and do it with. It's great if you watch the video and you get an idea of all the steps in the process, but it's good just to have someone sort of double check what's going on. Sometimes when you're doing a job for the first time, you learn a certain amount from video, but you sort of don't know what you don't know, if you know what I mean. You may not necessarily know when something's not feeling right or not seeming right, because you don't have any sort of reference point for it, and that's where it's really nice to sit down with someone who has done the job. So having said all that, we'll get into it now. I will go through all the steps, and I'll also go through some steps to sort of check the job at the end, and hopefully they'll give you a bit more confidence in the job you've done by changing these bearings. But once again, if you're in any doubt at all, please get the advice of a professional before you sort of hit the road. Before we jack the trailer up, I'm going to take off the centre hub cover and just crack the wheel nuts. It's much easier when the wheel can't spin to get those things done. Most trailers will just have a cover over the axle nut here. In this case, we've got these bearing buddies on, and they're quite good, particularly for marine trailers. They're just a sprung-loaded mechanism that has a grease nipple in it, so you fill it with grease, which pushes the spring out, and then slowly over time it just keeps pressurised grease going into the bearings. So they're a nice upgrade for a trailer, and we'll talk a bit more about those later. But for now, we need to get it off. Now, a pair of multi-grips like this can often be the go, but this one I actually took from the other side and it was quite tough to get off. So to get this off, all I'm going to do is just tap a little bit around the edge of it. There we go. So no damage, nice and round still. Just an easy way to get it off, if it is that stuck. Next thing I'm going to do is just crack all these wheel nuts. So I'm just making sure they're all starting to turn reasonably freely before I get the wheel up off the ground. Alright, now we're set to jack it up. I'm going to use a floor jack to jack this up, but I am going to use a block of wood on top of it, just because I need to get a little bit taller, and this jack stand's not very tall, so it's sitting on a set of blocks. This is a very flat concrete surface, so I'm pretty comfortable with the stability of all of this, and I've also got the trailer attached to the car still, so it's not going anywhere. If you don't have the trailer attached to the car, just chock the far wheel to give it a bit more stability. Then I'm just going to lower the trailer slowly so the jack stand's taking the weight, and then just leave this jack in place. Obviously we're not getting under the trailer at all, we're working from the side here, but you can't be safe enough doing this kind of stuff. Because I'm incredibly lazy, I'm just going to use a rattle gun to get this off, but because you've broken them before, pretty easy to get off with hand tools as well. All the wheel nuts off now, the wheel will just come off. If it is a bit stuck, just give it a bit of a hit, top or bottom from behind, just to get it off from the corrosion. Now we've got our brakes to deal with here. These are looking very nasty and rusty. We inherited this trailer quite recently, and it's well overdue for a bit of care. Round the back behind the hub here, be careful you're sticking your head in here, because if the trailer drops, it's going to hurt. But what we've got is one nut here, and you can see I've got a 15mm socket on here. This nut was a little bit corroded, so I've had to hammer this socket on a bit, but you could definitely plane it up with a wire wheel or something. And then below it, just under that spring there, is the second fastener that's holding this brake pad bracket on. So we'll take this off, take the bracket off, and then we can get this rotor off. Once that first fastener's off, the bracket here is free to rotate. I think I might have to get a spanner in for this next one, because this nut here is directly across from the leaf springs, so I can't get the impact gun in, or a socket for that matter. Now, not all trailers have brakes, and if they don't have brakes, then your job's going to be a lot easier than this. And while I'm undoing this, it's probably a good time to say I saw some viewers out on the water for the first time ever last week, coming out of Brooklyn Channel, so hello to you, whoever you were. Shame we didn't get a chance to chat. Okay, second bolt out. Ugh. Nasty. So if you don't have brakes, this is pretty much where you'll start. You'll take the wheel off and you'll have a hub with some wheel studs on it. You just won't have the disc rotor. It'll probably be a slightly different shape, but very similar in principle. With this assembly all still together, now's probably a good time to show you that you shouldn't have any play in this hub at all. It should turn, but you shouldn't be able to rock it top to bottom or left to right. So for example, if you've got a wheel like this, where it's flopping around really, really badly, then you know you've got bearing trouble. And obviously this is an extreme case, but even the slightest wobble is an indication there's something up with your bearings. So what I'm going to do now is take this axle nut off. This castellated nut is on the end of the axle here, holding this hub on, and it's got a split pin through here, very similar to the nut on the end of a propeller, or the end of a propeller shaft I should say. So just going to straighten this split pin, knock it through a bit, and then lever it out. Now these nuts generally aren't done up that tightly. If they do, it stops the hub turning, and this is a 32mm socket. So split pin off, nut off, washer behind here. Should have grabbed a screwdriver, mine, and washer. And in here, this is the outer bearing, and the bearing race is pressed into this hub, and lots of nasty old grease. You can pull this all out as one unit, or you can take this bearing out. Doesn't really matter. Now this hub we can just pull off, and I'll show you that closer in a minute. And then what we're left with is the bare axle now. So this is our bare axle now. This top surface here is where the oil or grease seal runs. Then we have the larger inner bearing runs along here. Then the smaller outer bearing runs along here. And then here's the, let's see if we can get this to focus. There we go. This is the where the axle nut goes on, and the hole where the split pin goes through. The next thing we have to decide is what type of bearings we want. In Australia there's two main types. You'll see that one says a Holden type, and this is a Ford type. I don't know what they're called overseas. I guess Holden's a General Motors sort of subsidiary, so I guess they're probably GM ones in the States, maybe Opel or something in Europe, but that's what they're called in Australia. Now, the biggest difference between them is that they're for different axle sizes. So if we see here, we'll see on the top of that one it says, trying to read that backwards now, bearing suits 39mm, which is the Holden type, and this one says bearing size 45mm. So the inner diameter is larger on the Ford type, but their outer diameter are exactly the same. So these bearings will both press into the hub, the same hub. You don't need different hubs. So the outer on the Ford and Holden the same, but the Holden has a smaller axle diameter. So we're going to measure the axle we've got here, and that way we know we're using the right one. Obviously I have them both here so I could just test fit them, but if you're ordering them, it's good to do this measurement, then just make sure you get the right ones sent out. So we'll take these calipers, pop them on here. We'll see you've got about a 46.6. So take away a bit of galvanized coating and some grease, etc. And we've pretty much got a 45mm square axle. And so we look at this type, and it's a 45 square axle, so we're after the Ford type bearings for this trailer. So on the very outside here, the first thing you're going to come across is the oil seal, designed to keep all this gunk in. So that was a lot harder to get out than it should have been, but once again, largely due to the fact this hasn't been serviced in a long time. Regular maintenance certainly goes a long way. Inside here we've got the inner bearing, and all that's left in here now is the inner and outer races, which is what the bearing run against, and a whole lot of really old nasty grease. So we'll clean this out and then we'll punch out the old races. To start with, I'm just going to take a rag and just scoop out the bulk of this old grease. Then I'll just give it a little squirt with brake cleaner, which I use for just about everything, given we buy it by the drum. Inside the hub now you can see this section here, which is the inner race, the larger inner one. And then on this side you've got the smaller outer race. So we need to get a punch and punch those out. They're in quite tightly, so it does take a bit of force to get them out. But what you'll notice is this one obviously comes out this way, the short way. And if you look down through here, you'll see there's just a little lip here. And that's what we're looking to get a punch onto, and a hammer, and push them out that way. And the same with this one. There's just a lip on this side. We're going to use that to pull them out. I'm going to use this bit of metal rod to punch this out. Often I find it's best if you rest the punch against this part of the hub and angle it across to the lip of that race on the far side. That way the punch is kind of wedged in quite well and it won't slip off that edge as readily. After lots and lots of hammering away at that outer race, it's not budged at all. So I'm going to put a bit of heat on this hub, just try and get the hub to expand a little bit more. Then we'll get back to using the punch to try and get it out. Seems a bit of a theme on this channel, not being able to get corroded parts apart, but you know, that's salt water for you. That is the most stuck I've ever seen a bearing race. Alright, we're getting there. This race is now flush with the outside of the hub, so I can't do it on the ground anymore. I am just going to put it up in the vise and tap it out the last way. Yay! Both the inner and outer races are out now. You can see the sections inside the hub where they go are both clear. Now it's time to put the new races in. So this is the kit we had earlier, which is the Ford type marine bearing kit. So be aware, I'm not sure if I emphasised it, but make sure you do buy marine bearings if it is for your boat trailer. I've got another kit arriving this afternoon that also has the dust caps on it. But in this kit you've got the oil seal, which comes as a 2-part unit, and the 2 bearings. So these are the new races that are on top of the bearings, and we're going to use the old races to press these in. So I'll start with this outer one. The races have a thick side and a thin edge here, so they're sort of a cone shaped, and you want it so the thick edge goes down. That way the bearing itself can slot in. If you put it in this way, you can't get the bearing in behind it. So you've got to make sure you push it in the right way, which is the flared wide section pointing up with a thin edge here pointing outwards, so that you can drop the bearing on top. Before I've pressed this in, I've cleaned this surface up a little bit. If your hub is particularly bad, just buy new hubs. Look, in this case they're mostly reusable, but when they get to a certain point, if this bearing, for example, sits in too easily, it'll spin. Inside here it needs to be a tight fit. The hubs just aren't that expensive, so if you decide it's time to retire existing ones, so be it. To start with, I'm just going to hammer around till it starts going down square, and once it's flush, that's when I'm going to start using the old race to push this one in deeper. Before I start hammering it in, these other kits arrived, and the big difference here is they don't come with a split pin, but they do come with the cap here. So this cap is what takes the place of this bearing buddy we took off, and this is pretty common as a standard fitting. This is sort of considered, I guess, a bit of an upgrade. To begin getting this down, I'm actually going to use a block of hardwood on here. This is a piece of Merbau. Don't recommend using Merbau because it's actually made from compressed orangutans, seriously. Same process as before. Keep tapping evenly around. You don't want it to get skewed. Whether it's going in or coming out, try and keep it as flat and as level as possible. Once you've got the new race flush, and they can take a bit of beating, they're really strong metal, so the hammer's not going to dent it at all. But once it's flush, you can't get it any further without taking the other race and using that to hammer it in till it goes all the way against the stop. The really important thing with this is don't put it thin edge to thin edge like that. Put it in the same orientation, so the thick edge pointing down and the thin edge pointing up. And the reason for that is if you put it in this way, once you've got it in, you've got no way of getting this old one back out. Whereas if you put it this way, what we're going to do is use that punch to punch it out again, and because this thick edge is against the thin edge, we've actually got a lip to hook on to press the old one out once it's done its job. So always make sure the thick edge down as you start to drive the new race home. So this is where we're at now. The new race is all the way down, it's hard up against this lip here, and it's even all the way around. The old race is in here having done its job of pushing this all the way home, but because this thick edge is down, there's a lip here, which means we can turn this over and use that same method just to pop the old one out, leaving the new one in place. So I'll do that on the vise, and then we're ready to do the other side. This time round, we've got to make sure we're getting the back of the old race, not the back of the new one, because we're only trying to push one out, not both out, obviously. So that now is the old one back out and the new one in position. So I'm going to go through that same process for the inner race, and then we're ready to put this hub back together. So we now have the new race on that side and on that side, and this hub's ready to start putting back on. Sometimes I wonder if this channel isn't about sort of putting people off doing it yourself. Every time I film something, it turns out to be harder than it should be. Next step is to pack the bearings with grease. In this case, this is specifically a greaser boat trailers in mind, and actually is lithium-based grease from memory. Yes. So that's really what you're looking for to make sure you got the right grease. We're going to pack the grease from this larger open side through to the top where it's tapered smaller. And the very first step to that is simply throwing it down into our grease, that way down, and seeing how much we can get through. Yeah. Oddly fun and satisfying. Then, take a big chunk of grease in your hand, in your palm, and then you're looking to press down on it, starting from the bottom, until you actually see it oozing up through the top. So whatever grease comes past the bearing, I just sort of scoop back into the palm of my other hand that's not holding the bearing, and just there, don't know if it's going to show you clearly enough, you can see where it's bubbled up on the top, and that's not grease that's just ended up on the top, that's grease that's actually pushed all the way through from the bottom. There's a knack to this, and I clearly don't have it. I get there in the end. I definitely just keep going round until you see the grease come up from the bottom all the way to the top. But I'm not quick or particularly effective at it. You can actually buy bearing packers where you put the grease in and just press it down. Do a great job. They're not that expensive, but the other mechanic here won't let me buy one until I get better at doing it by hand. So, you know, fair enough. I'll probably appreciate that in years to come. That's the grease bearing in its place now. Then we've got this oil seal holder that goes on the top here. It's a bit much thinner metal, so I'm just going to get a piece of wood again and hammer it down evenly. Actually, I might even just use one of these old brake pads, given I'm throwing them away. That's certainly never going back on a vehicle. And once that's down, the oil seal goes on top. So now that's together, I'm going to flip that over. We'll grease the outer bearing. We'll pop that in, and then we'll slide the whole thing on. Now, what I'm going to do now is flip this back over. That grease will generally be enough to hold the bearing in. I'm actually going to now put a rubber grease around here. No gloves, but I'll survive. That just levels off this cavity between the two bearings. And as the wheel spins, the centrifugal force will sort of distribute that grease a bit, and ending up with a layer in there like that. Alright, it's starting to rain now, so let's get this back together. Oil seal back on top of the inner bearing, and then all I need to do is slide the whole thing on until that oil seal's up on the other shaft. This outer bearing dropped out, so I'll just slide it in. There we go. And we're in business. Then the washer, cleaned up a bit. And this castellated nut. Just make sure it's threaded properly. Often by turning them the opposite way, you'll sort of hear the threads click, and then you know they're good to go and wind on without being cross-threaded. What I did then was actually tighten it quite a bit. Still turns, but what I'm trying to do is use that nut to push the mechanism right onto the axle, and then I'll back it off slightly so that the hub can turn freely. There are specifications for a lot of hubs, particularly if they're actual vehicle hubs, saying that if you put a spring scale on one of these studs and then you pull this scale down, like a fish weighing scale kind of thing, how many kilograms does it take of force before this hub starts to turn? If it takes too much, loosen the nut slightly. If it takes too little, tighten the nut slightly. Going by feel is not a great thing to do in a video because it's very hard to demonstrate what something feels like, what's too loose, what's too tight. But really what we're looking at is having it spin, finding the point where any tighter and it starts to bind up, and then backing it off. It's starting to bind up there, so I'm just going to back it off slightly, and then I'm going to find a section where the castellated nut lines up with the hole through the axle and put a new split pin in. Here's our new split pin. Just tap it through. Bend up the longer leg so it's flush, and then trim off the shorter one. So if you're putting these brakes back on, I'm not going to because they need a bit of work. Put the holder back on, Loctite on the two nuts, and do them up to whatever the manufacturer's specification is, with enough torque, enough stretch in those bolts so they don't come undone. So now I'm going to pop the wheel back on this, check it for any play in any direction, and then we can lower it down again. Alright, I've got all these nuts started to make sure they're not cross-threaded, and then I'm just going to pop them on in a bit of a star pattern, just to make sure they come down evenly. And if it wasn't raining, I'd go and get my torque wrench and make sure they're all done up to 110 Newton meters. But it is raining, so I'm going inside. Sorry, before I run away, one thing I was going to say is once you've got it all back together, just feel if you've got any play. If you've got any play top and bottom, side to side, you know something's wrong with your bearing installation. It's stopped raining here now, so I'll just finish up quickly and put this bearing buddy back on. Sometimes, as we said before, it'll just be a cap, that's fine. What I'm going to do though is I've cleaned it out, so I'm simply going to pack this bearing buddy with new grease, which you can also do to your ordinary cap, but it's not necessary. And then press this back on. Obviously, as you put it in, it's going to displace a bit of that oil, whatever space the axle nut takes up, but it just saves you a lot of pumping away on the grease gun afterwards. So that's in, and we'll just pump a bit more grease into it. As you pump grease with the grease gun, that bearing buddy is starting to come forward slightly, compressing that spring. So that bearing buddy's back on now, grease pumped into it. So this side's pretty much ready to go. Obviously we have to do the other side of the trailer, but that's the whole process for one wheel from go to woe. So thanks for watching. I hope this sort of shows you what's involved in changing a set of wheel bearings on a trailer, on a boat trailer. I would urge you though to err on the side of caution if you're not confident with this job. Perhaps it is one best left to a mechanic to do for you. But having said that, it's not rocket science. If you do this job, I'd recommend taking the boat for a very short, sort of lower speed run around the block, do a bit of testing, come back, maybe jack it up and see if there's any play in the wheel after you've had a little run around the block. Just before you sort of hit the road and go do high-speed trips or whatever. One last thing I will say is if you're using bearing buddies, make sure that whatever grease you've got in your grease gun is both the marine grease and compatible with whatever grease you had in the tub that you use for packing the bearings. So just make sure those two greases are both fit for purpose and go with each other. So thanks again, hope you enjoyed the video, Our winter's obviously coming with all this rain, which means that the Northern Hemisphere summer and boating season's around the corner, and this is obviously a good bit of maintenance to do before you start using your boat for another season. I think I looked up the other day that I think 88% of the world's population or something like that lives in the Northern Hemisphere, so plenty of boating ahead. All right, take care, see ya.